So welcome everybody to this seminar on gender and peacebuilding, how to address the lack of women. I'm Nina Willen. I'm the Africa Director at the Egmont Institute, and I'm really happy to welcome you all here today. This is a seminar that's jointly organized with the Egmont Institute, with the ECDPM, with the EPC, the European Policy Center, with Ricardo Borges, head of the European Well Program, and with the King Baudouin Foundation, who is an organization that is giving the Africa Prize every year. And this year it is given to Ilwad Elman, who's here today. We're very happy about that. I'm only saying this to welcome you here, and now I'm handing over to Ricardo.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you also for welcoming us, and welcome everyone this afternoon for this very important discussion. Also to those that are following us online, a very, very warm welcome. For those, Nina just introduced me, but for those that don't know me, and for the benefit of those that are at home, my name is Ricardo Borges de Castro. I'm an Associate Director and Head of Europe in the World Program at the European Policy Center. And it's indeed as well for me to, as Nina, to welcome everyone to today's discussion, gender and peace building, how to address the lack of women. And frankly, to tell you that I could not be in better company to discuss this topic than the three distinguished speakers that are joining us. So Ilwad Elman, she's the Director of Programs at Elman Peace Center in Mogadishu, Somalia. Maria Martin de Almargo, who is Assistant Professor of Conflict and Development Studies at Ghent University. And last but not least, Nina Willen, she's the Director of Africa Program Egmont here at the Egmont Institute, and she's also an associate professor at Antwerp University. So welcome Ilwad, welcome Maria, and welcome Nina to this seminar. And Nina, again, thank you for welcoming us at your home at Egmont Institute. And today's event is, as Nina has also mentioned, is jointly organized by the Egmont Institute, by the King Baudouin Foundation, the European Center for Development Policy Management, and by the European Policy Center. And we do this to highlight and celebrate the outstanding work of the Elman Peace Center in Somalia. And particularly, I think we are also here to mark the occasion that the Elman Peace Center has been awarded the King Baudouin Foundation Africa Prize. And it's been done in recognition of the center's successful efforts to combat violence and promote social justice and peace. I think its record of empowering and cultivating leadership among women and children, it's really outstanding. And it's also, I think the prize is given so that this example, or that your experience can be emulated by others. So it's really extraordinary, Ilwad, that you could join us today, that you took your time to spend 1 hour or more, a little bit more, to discuss this, and also for what I know it's going to be a very busy week for you. So welcome also to Belgium and to Brussels. Before I open the floor to our speakers, I wanted just to run a little bit through not only the structure, but also the content of our conversation. So I'll give the floor to our speakers very shortly, and they will each speak for up to 10 minutes to address the questions that we are here to discuss, and then I'll open the floor. We also might have questions from the virtual room, so we will take those questions as well. Remco will help me do that, and those that also, when you ask your questions, what I would ask you is that do them loudly, and probably I or Remco will repeat them so that the people in the virtual floor can actually know the questions that are being asked by you. So today, I think the goal of today's discussion is really to despite there's a growing attention to women's sidelining in matters related to peace and conflict following the adoption of the UN resolution 1325 already in 2000. So it's been almost 22 years of this resolution. Women continue to be marginalized in peacekeeping missions, in peace negotiations, in peace building, and even in the aftermath of wars, which is an area that Maria really looks into. So this seminar is really to address this question: why women, despite being probably more affected, are disproportionately more affected by conflict and war? Why are they then less represented when we move to peace moments, to peace building, to peace accords? Why is this happening? And so we want to look at this problem, and we have some 3 or 4 central questions that we would like to address. So what are the spaces and places for women? What spaces and spaces do they occupy in peace accords? Why are women continuously marginalized in peace and security negotiations? What are the implications that women's participation have for the post-conflict peace building process? And finally, how is it impossible really that we can increase women's participation in an inclusion in peace building processes, also without entering into essentialist discussions about concepts that I think Nina will also help us navigate, and Ilbat certainly on some of these issues. And so, as I said, we have the perfect panel to discuss this. And without further ado, I want to go to Ilwat first. And Ilwat, I mean, your journey is an extraordinary journey. And you bring also your personal experience. And you have been directly, you and your family, affected by what we are discussing. So it's not an abstract discussion, I think, for you and maybe for others that are here in the room. So, I mean, but you have also chosen the path, first to go back to your country, and also you've chosen the path of peace and the path of trying to help women and children being, again, integrated in society and basically try to choose peace and not conflict and war. So, I mean, from your experience, how would you, also bringing women and being a leader, woman leader, how do you see your journey, and how do you see, how can we address this issue of continuously not marginalizing women in peace and security? Thank you again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and for having me here for this very important conversation. And maybe before I begin to introduce my work and myself and my journey, allow me to provoke the title of our session a little bit. We're on 20th year of celebrating that anniversary, Resolution 1325, and we romanticize these resolutions and these declarations and commitments and pledges, and that an extraordinary amount of work and effort and resources went into, and we celebrate them every year, but we don't hold ourselves to account as to how many women are actually participating as a result of these resolutions that we've developed that are not necessarily fit for the context that we're in today. So the question that we're even asking is a bit remiss and outdated, talking about why are women not yet included meaningfully in the peace building process. So I'm looking forward to a discussion that hopefully will allow us to be introspective and leverage each other's experiences. And to start with mine, I was born in Somalia. I was born to two ardent peace and human rights activists. My last name is Elman, as you can see, and the organization that I work for is called the Elman Peace Center. It was founded by my late father, a peace activist, who began what has been lauded as the earliest community-based disarmament reintegration program led by an individual before an institution or organization or without funding in Somalia, at least at the height of the civil conflict, and had a campaign called Drop the Gun, Pick Up the Pen. So my parents worked together on essentially offering alternative, dignified livelihoods to young men that are being co-opted by the warlords into fighting for the militia groups. And he was so effective, demobilizing and disarming thousands of young men, that he was killed for the work that he was doing. My mother fled with my sisters and I, and like millions of others, Somalis and refugees around the world, we fled and spent some time in neighboring countries until we got asylum in Canada. So I grew up in Canada, and my mother was and is a fierce custodian of my father's legacy, and had always instilled in us as a single mother with only daughters that we not only have an opportunity at a very young age, put that responsibility on us, that we have an opportunity in Canada, and that we also have a responsibility to think about what our purpose can be in the future. So it was never prescribed for me to come back, but we always knew that she was going to go back. In fact, she had a benchmark, which was when my younger sister was in high school at the age of, when she was 14, that she was going to go back to Somalia. And My younger sister was 14, I was 16, my eldest sister was 18, and then she went back to Somalia to kind of continue the work that she and my father were doing together, because she felt we were responsible and old enough to take care of ourselves, and we were. At 19, I decided to go back to Somalia and to join her, having somewhat of a midlife crisis, if you will, trying to understand what my journey is, what my path is, knowing the sacrifices that my family has made, and this unwavering commitment that they've had to being involved in the peace process in Somalia. So I wanted to, one, understand why she was there when we needed her, and two, also to, gain direction like many young people at that time in their life do. And she also went back at a time that it was very difficult to communicate with her. We'd lose contact with her for weeks at a time. So I went in 2010, what was supposed to be for just 1 month, and that turned into 13 years almost. So I began working with her and stayed in Somalia because I saw the challenges that she was facing in trying to be a part of the peace building process as a woman. I saw the reprisals, the harassments, the threats, the lack of access to resources, to funding, to networks, and also the challenges that she got from my own family, from my father's side, to be very honest with you, because she had no sons. And a woman that has no sons cannot carry a legacy, cannot start an organization in honor of my father's legacy. And then I was confronted with, the reality that if she, as a privileged woman with a Canadian passport and could leave at any time, is staying, what does that then look like for a widow woman in Somalia that doesn't have the opportunity to leave, or a young girl that's been forced into marriage, or other historically marginalized minority groups? And I also saw the way that we needed her, hundreds of other people needed her. And the demographic of people that she was working with primarily were children and youth. The population in Somalia, 78% is under the age of 30. And more than 50% of that is under the age of 15. And the country has been in conflict for 30 years. So you have essentially a nation of children. So I understood right away why her focus remained on working with young people, because of one, their malleable minds and the ability to still influence them, and that this conflict is only one generation old. And so the LNP Center at the core of it is a peace building institution and also a human rights-based organization. We monitor, we document, and report on violations and abuses, but we also focus on providing services and reprieve and some sort of intervention to address that, and not just collecting data. And in 2010, when I first went back, it coincided with a terrible humanitarian crisis. We saw mostly women with children in tow, all flocking to Mogadishu from the rural areas because of the famine. And since then, almost like clockwork, every 5 years, even now, we are in the middle of a drought and a looming famine. We see that women are disproportionately affected by conflict, by environmental degradation, by lack of access to services, to patriarchal systems, to exclusionary policies. And the question of why women can't meaningfully engage is it's loaded, but I think the biggest challenge that we see is that there hasn't been much evolution in the way that we view women's unique influence in the community. So the work that we're involved with is on disarmament, rehabilitation, and reintegration of young people, including young women, children, and adults that are leaving armed groups, terrorist organizations, children within the ranks of military groups with the government. And all of these spaces are not spaces that women are generally allowed to participate in. To your question of what are the spaces that women engage in when it comes to peace and security, there's non-threatening issues that women can engage in, peer-to-peer, community mobilization, awareness raising, advocacy, all important parts of the peace process. But when it comes to insider mediation, reconciliation, peace agreements, disarmament, there's certain levels that there becomes a barrier for women's participation. And we see that till today in Somalia, but across the world as well. So our approach to building peace and meaningfully including women is investing in social peace as much as we do in political peace. There's 56 active armed conflicts in the world today. Statistically, UN or political peace building agreements don't last more than 7 years. And each time we hear about women being the breadwinners, you teach a woman, you teach a village, and the intrinsic role that they have, and all the rhetoric is there. But every time there's an opportunity to actually implement the frameworks and the toolboxes, the patriarchy rears its ugly head, and we resort to the laziest and fastest option. The most recent example of that is in Somalia just now, when we had a political stalemate where the previous president tried to stay in his position for an extended year, and there's political violence, and the community saw this bubbling, and it was widely foreseen, and it escalated. And then instead of actually implementing the frameworks that we champion all year round, when there is armed conflict, we resorted to the same 5 men elders being brought into the room to just de-escalate the situation. And the impact that has on the inclusion of women in peace and security is significant, because another example from Somalia is that because of this political stalemate, because of the conflict, 5 years ago, in the last administration, there was a huge push from the international community, from local women organizations, to try to reach a 30% quota in political participation. But because of the conflict that happened now, that agenda of trying to have more women in parliament and government positions in the new administration was completely sidelined. So the number of women that we had participating in the last administration has reduced in this current one. And that's because we always want to resolve conflict by excluding women and not thinking that adding more women in the process as a fundamental priority, but not an optional second, will be more sustainable. I don't want to speak too long because I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'll speak to my experience a little bit as well too, as a young woman in the space as well. And I think that when we talk about women, peace and security and inclusion, that in itself is also a very challenging environment for young peace builders. When we talk about women and peace and security, it's older, elite, influential, iconic women. And in my context, and in many, culture overrides that as well too. So that if I'm sitting in a room like this full of more seasoned, older women, I'd have the same challenges as speaking as I would if it was a room full of men because of age. When we talk about youth peace and security agenda, it primarily means young, elite, accessible, young men. So young women in this space are doubly excluded from the process. And I think that there are ways that we can move this agenda forward, but it has to start with matching the resources to the rhetoric, to holding ourselves accountable and implementing these frameworks that we have. And I think maybe I'll just halt for there so we can have a conversation with you.
Thank you, and thank you, Ilwat, for also, bringing the journey, the experience. Also, I think this very important idea that moving from rhetoric to actually results and implementation, which is really, really important. Thank you also for speaking about your mom, Fartun Adan, and the leading role that she has had also in the. I imagine as a role model as well, maybe for you and for many other young women. But going back to a point that you also mentioned on the spaces and roles in peace for in peace agreements for women. Nina, you have been working a lot. Also, you've done a lot of important research on this topic, and particularly also on peace agreements in Africa. You have a book that is about to come out or has already come out on this topic. So, over to you. Ilwat left a lot of things to unpack, so I don't know if you want to pick on some of them as well, and the floor is yours, and thank you again.
Thank you. So it's hard to come after such a strong statement, and I'm really privileged to be here and listen to you and learn from your experience, of course. I'm lucky enough to have that personal experience of being part or in a conflict. But I think as women in general, and whether young or I don't even know if I can be considered young anymore, but I think I'm on the verge, we still face different barriers. I'm going into the more abstract or practical, let's say, sphere, because I'm going to talk about the research that I've just recently finished, which is looking into how women are portrayed in peace agreements in Africa. So what are the spaces and roles that are given to women in peace agreements in Africa? So I see peace agreements as more or less of blueprints of what the post-conflict society will look like. So how are we going to rebuild the society after a conflict? Well, peace agreements are there as an idea of what type of society we want to rebuild. And Ilwat has already mentioned that women are not very present in peace agreements. And in fact, the signatories to peace agreements are still almost exclusively men. Only 5% of signatories to all major peace agreements between 1919 and 2017 worldwide were women. So we have some space to go. And this is even after the UN resolution 1325 in 2000 was approved, as Ilwat just mentioned. So, it's a question of moving forward, but that doesn't seem to happen very much. So from my research, I did a discursive analysis of 130 peace agreements from interstate and intrastate conflicts in Africa between 1990 and 2019, which have provisions on women and girls in them. So, of course, not all peace agreements during this period have provisions or don't mention women and girls. So these are only about a third of all of the peace agreements that were signed in the same period. So there were 463 peace agreements signed in the same period for these types of conflicts, and only 130 made allusion to women and girls. So I should say that that's a focus of my research. There was a difference in terms of how many of these agreements that mentioned women and girls before and after Resolution 1325. So only 17% of the peace agreements mentioned women before 1325, and after 1325, so after 2000, it's been about 33%. So there is an increase, even though it's still modest, let's say. And as you can see, that period is quite long. It's 30 years. And there are various different conflicts that it covers. But still, the space and the wording given to women in all of these peace agreements are remarkably similar. Even if we look at different periods, we look at different conflicts, and we look at different regions. So I've been trying to identify 4 categories that, let's say, give us an indication of how women are portrayed in these peace agreements. The first one are, so it's my words, vulnerable victims, moral peace builders, counting women, and human rights and women's rights. So I'll just really briefly go through the 4 categories. The first one, vulnerable victims. The women are predominantly mentioned in peace agreements as part of the vulnerable populations. Often women are grouped into the infamous women and children category, preceded or followed by demands to protect or to respect a particularly vulnerable group. The Arusha Agreement from 2000, for example, puts women heads of families in the same vulnerable population as juvenile delinquents, traumatized children, child heads of families, and the physically and mentally disabled. So what does this do? What are the consequences of putting women into this vulnerable group? One consequence is that it reinforces gender stereotypes of women as passive and weak. So it undermines their influence and power to actually have an impact into the peace building process. Another consequence is that when women are associated with the groups such as elderly, the disabled, or the traumatized children, there is an assumption that women constitute a minority, a sociological category, just that the category is based on age, race, religion, or handicap. So this categorization draws attention from the fact that women contribute 50% of the population, while undermining the potential of women as independent actors with rights. So the second category that I identified was moral peace builders. So what do I mean with that? Well, what you could see in the peace agreement was that a recurrent trend in them was that women are defined for what they are rather than what they do. So this plays out in a paradoxical way. On the one hand, women are seen as inherently vulnerable, as passive victims in need of protection. But on the other hand, the understandings are that women are innately peaceful and morally superior to others, let's say to men, and that puts them in a position of moral responsibility for the country's post-conflict rebuilding. So I'm giving you an example from the Sun City Agreement for the inter-Congolese negotiations from 2003, which urged the parties to, and I'm quoting, restore the dignity of women so that they may fully assume their noble roles of wives, mothers, educators, custodians of social values, and development agents. So this declaration manages to put the burden of women to be custodians of social values and also to regulate their behavior, to be morally apt. And it establishes women's roles to the private sphere as wives and mothers, and outside of the public political sphere where decisions are made and where the peace building process is taking place. And we've already seen that this responsibility as moral peace builder, it rarely materializes in a seat at the table. The third category is counting women. Quotas in state institutions, power sharing agreements are very common when in peace agreements. And adding more women to ameliorate the gender balance is a common question. And as Ilwed has said, that's not even sure that will be attended to, because that often comes in a second period after the end of the conflict. And even then, it's critical. This idea of adding women has been criticized for reducing the question of gender equality to a numbers game, bypassing the structured inequality that women face. Some critics have also argued that women delegates are not representatives of women in society, that they often just are representing the elite and not the average woman. And these are valid points. But then at the same time, numbers are not enough, but they are necessary. If we are to move forward, there is a need for a larger participation of women in all institutions, bypassing that critical number of 30%. Because if we don't do that, then these institutions remain by and for men. And the criticism against women not being representative of other women, it's funny because that critique has never been addressed to the men that are sitting around the table. So that's also something to reflect further on. And then I'm ending with the fourth category, human rights / women's rights. Several of the peace agreements that I looked into mentioned human rights, but some of them also added the specific mention of women's rights. So this gives the impression that women were not included in the overarching concept of human rights. The addition of women's rights to human rights reflects long-standing feminist criticism, pointing to the fact that mainstream international organs established for the promotions and protection of human rights do not deal specifically with violations of human rights of women. Feminist scholars have also demonstrated that up until very recently, human rights have privileged the able-bodied adult men rather than women or children, as women's concerns often are submerged into global issues. So it's likely that the peace agreements analyzed here, which have added this specific women's rights in addition to human rights, have done so to make sure that women's rights are addressed and are not downplayed or neglected. But there is a risk that this practice of adding women's rights to references of human rights backfires. Why is that? Because you're resulting in a narrowing down of the global rights human rights perspective, and you're kind of constructing this sort of women's ghetto, which usually gets less resources than any human rights concept will ever get. It will also lower priority to the women resources, as we've seen. The UN Security Council Resolution 1325 has drawn a lot of attention, but very little resources to actually implement it. So there is a risk that human rights is interpreted synonymously with men's rights, whether then you have to add women's right to actually even talk about women's rights. Again, an optional add-on. So to conclude, while there is still an increase in the number of references to women and girls in peace agreements signed after 2000, they still draw strongly on these essentialist ideas that we still hold about women in 2022. So I would therefore argue that while we may have passed the stage of gender blindness, we're still very much in the face of gender dilemmas. And I'll end here.
Thank you, Nina, for ending in that dilemma. I won't even venture into it. I'll leave it this to the discussion. But I mean, you also unpacked a lot of what might be, at least on reading these agreements, what might be positive results. But again, you came back again to the same issue as Ilwad was saying. It's about the resources. It's about actually the concrete results that you are able to achieve. And I think this is also a very good segue to pass on to Maria, because I mean, you of course focusing a lot on the peacemaking moment as well. But and Maria has studied a lot the aftermath of war, sort of more of the peace building, sort of and sustaining these processes in the longer run. So again, I mean, what happens to women and to women in these processes when they do? I mean, Hilbert also mentioned that this sometimes peace doesn't last for more than 7 years after the peace deal. But so, what is the role of women here, and how do you address these questions? How can we increase really more in the governance of then societies in the presence that they could have a sort of a more sustainable role in all of this? So, Nadia, thank you again for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. And also, if it was difficult, Nina, for you to come after Eva, imagine how difficult it is for me to come after you too. But I think that Eva and Nina have already given us a good picture of what peace agreements and what peace signing of a peace accord look like for women. And what I would like to talk today a little bit more is about not only about whether we should include women on the negotiation table, but also which women should be there, and also how not having women on the negotiation table results also in having post-war efforts and peace-building reconstruction efforts that look a little bit, or that could also reinforce gender inequalities in the aftermath of war. So when I have done a lot of research in Liberia on and around this question, and when I was asking Liberian women and rural women what peace looks like to them, they were saying very simple things such as having food on the table, being able to walk to school, but these are not the things that are being discussed in the peace accords that Nina was just talking about. These are not really either the things that post-war reconstruction efforts by the UN and other international organizations are focusing on. So what I would like to convey here is the idea of what is a feminist peace. What does a feminist peace look like? Or what is a peace? What could be a feminist peace agreement? I'm gonna also bring back this idea that Ilwat was mentioning about the social peace versus the political peace, because a feminist peace agreement would ensure the economic and also the spiritual empowerment of the most marginalized in society. So a feminist peace, instead of talking about how we go towards economic production after war. How do we put back a country into the world economic arena? How about we put at the center the reproduction of human life? What would a country look like? What a peace agreement would look like if we think, or if we put at the center social reproduction, making sure that people are living a good life. And therefore, a feminist peace concentrates not only on redistributing material resources, but also ensuring that the promotion of cultural and spiritual heritage of communities is ensured, right? Some feminist scholars and Nina Nilbert had already mentioned this, have talked about how peace agreements, or even like after war, we have a window of opportunity for building a feminist peace, or for bringing gender equality. And international peace building programs often demand that post-war governments ensure a lot of reforms, right? Addressing socioeconomic issues, addressing land rights, decentralization programs, again, women's rights. However, oftentimes these early wins do not really result in a more feminist society in the long run. And also, they tend to enhance the situation of certain elite women, but they do not automatically filter down to rural communities. And the UN, World Bank, and IMF have been ensuring or trying to ensure this idea of getting back to the root causes of conflict and trying to address the root causes of conflict. And they have been funding a lot of land rights reforms and a lot of decentralization efforts, so that also power is decentralized and given back to local communities. And in those two things, land rights and decentralization programs, they have been also inserting or trying to insert clauses that bring back the women, peace and security agenda, that puts, again, gender equality and women's rights onto these new land reforms and decentralization efforts. But I would like to make 3 points here to show how and why these reforms and also the peace agreements only in part ensure women's rights. The first one is that, and here I'm going to point the finger towards the international community much more than only local governments, is that these land rights reform, decentralization efforts, and bringing in women there are very limited in their understandings of gender as a binary, women versus men. And they do not understand how in local communities, gender works with race, with age, with class, with ethnicity, how patriarchy doesn't work alone. So for example, in Liberia, the past couple of years, the Liberian government has been implementing a land reform that gives women two things. The first thing is the legal right to inherit, that up until now, in rural communities, women did not have the right to inherit. The right to inherit was passed from the man of the family towards the son, etc., etc. And the second thing is that women now need to have a 30% seat on the local councils that manage what happens with community land. What happens, whether should we sell the land to a private individual? Should we give the land to a concession company so that they can exploit it? However, I want to show here that this is actually quite ineffective. And again, if you look at how African feminists have argued why this is ineffective, it is again because if you look at how land rights work in rural Liberia, but in a lot of rural sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to have, first of all, that only people who have lived in the local community for at least 10 years have actually the right to inherit land, to sell it, or to do anything else with the land. Normally, when women get married, they travel to the community of their husbands. Therefore, even though by law, they have the right to in principle, to buy land, they do not have the right to buy land, because one of the exceptions is if you are a foreigner or a stranger. That means if you haven't lived in the local community for a long time. The second thing is that, of course, a minority of women with the resources will be able to buy land. However, now these provisions of land privatization, what are making is that the amount of land available for local communities is being reduced. What does that mean? Because now communities have the right to sell their land to private individuals. Now the majority of rural women who depended on that community land to get their to do crops for their own self-consumption, to sell small in the informal market, sell crops for being able to pay the school fees, etc., for the children. They do not have access to resources anymore, not even to for their own self-consumption. Furthermore, as I said, now this the local community council that decides on what is going to happen with land is obliged to have 30% of women sitting on the table. However, decisions have to be done by consensus and not by majority. This means in places where you have a local patriarchal society combined with an international neoliberal capitalist system that is forcing those countries to be productive with their land, this is forcing those women around the negotiation table to actually go with the majority, even if that would be affecting them negatively in the short run. My second point is that these reforms, actually, that the principle of economic growth at all costs, the prioritization and the understanding of land as economic resource only, and not also a resource where people pass on culture, or people pass on the ways in which communities cultivate their crops, where they pass on stories, where they pass on their history, damages more than helps. So local NGOs in Liberia pointed out that although the Land Rights Act implementation recognized that traditional communities institutions are male-dominated, that gender sensitization is essential, the privatization process was actually really detrimental to rural women. So apart from having less resources as well, the focus on economic growth is reducing as well the amount of money that the state is going to put on social reproduction. So in hospitals, in schools, and rural women not only have now the burden of being around the negotiation table, of being also mediators, as Nina and Ivat were mentioning, but they're also the added burden of now having to be carers, because there's less money as well for, again, schools, hospital, etc., etc. So we keep on adding tasks to these rural women because we think that they are natural peace builders as well. Finally, and I will end up with this third point, I think it's still important to carry on pushing for the implementation of gender mainstreaming and gender just post-war reforms, because they do also help, of course. Rural women in Liberia were telling me how there has been an international, there have been a shifting of international resources from the capital city, from Monrovia, to rural communities, to rural spaces. And that despite the implementation failures, despite the lack of consultation, these reforms have catalyzed conversations in rural communities about what it means to have to put the social reproduction communities good lives at the center of sustaining peace. And I'm going to give you two examples. The first example is a group of 6 women that I talked to in Bomi country, in Bomi country in Liberia. They had been receiving training so as to be able to be part of these councils that decide what is going to happen with community land. And what they were doing is to tell me how the knowledge that they acquired on negotiation processes they were using it not only to negotiate with concession companies when they come to discuss with local communities whether they could actually buy or rent the land, but they were also using that to negotiate with the local communities and ensuring that girls could also go to school, that they had to go to school as well. But this is also important, not only because of this, but also because of how in so doing, these rural women were challenging these international understandings of gender that differentiate between the productive sphere, between between peace as also economic empowerment and reproduction, and also peace as social reproduction, at ensuring that everybody in the local community has the rights and the opportunities to lead a good life. So ensuring that also local women, girls could go to school. So using their negotiation skills, not only to ensure that they will earn something from the concession company coming, but also to negotiate at home with husbands, with the elders, with the local chiefs, so that local girls could go to school. That also means that they are challenging international understandings, again, that prioritize economic production and putting the country back onto the good path of becoming a productive economy and centering the needs of the local members of the community. And I'm going to end up with that point, and I will be happy to further elaborate in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maria, for bringing us the example of Liberia, and also warning that patriarchy comes also with a lot of other factors, economic, cultural, that really reinforce then some of the problems that there are there to bring women into these processes. Also because it seems that, as you were saying, their burden actually increases instead of freeing up time from reproductive health or other opportunities that women would have to free up time to do other things. They can't because they still have all these roles that are perceived. So thank you for that. And thank you the three, because I think we impact a lot of ideas and important reflections on how probably sometimes the rhetoric of the resolution might be the right one, but the resources and the practical application, sometimes the rhetoric is not the right one because continues essentializing stereotypes and sort of an understanding of the role that women play in these processes. But before I would pass to the floor, and I think also to the virtual. I don't know, Remco, if there's already any questions but so I would invite those that are online to want to ask their questions. But I wanted to give again the opportunity. I would go for the Inwad, Nina, and Maria. Do you have reactions to things that others have said? Is there anything, Inwad, of I'm sure that you heard and you have actually also experienced some of the problems that both Nina and Maria have just expressed. So I don't know, is there any of the points that you would like to take before we we open the floor?
Absolutely. I think that this has been a really interesting conversation and reinforcing, I think, of our different types of experiences, because we're, I think, saying the same thing from different angles and really hearing about this juxtaposition between the burden that's put on women and the paradox that you have elaborated on in your research, and the burden that women have within culture to really uphold peace and to be peacemakers, but then also being systemically excluded from the process as well. We see that happening all the time, and that was reaffirmed in our conversation, and it's an existing reality today. I particularly was struck by your points of why we keep clumping women with other special interest groups as well, and what that really means for the value add that they can have and meaningfully engaging in peace processes. And so yeah, I think that we're constantly, I think, preaching to the converted when it comes to the issue of women's role, women's potential, their ability, the empirical evidence that exists of more women being involved in peace and security processes, the more sustainable those interventions are, and the diversity of the type of engagements women can be involved in. The evidence is there, the real life experiences are there, but the progress is still too painfully slow. That makes conversations like this, and hopefully the questions that will ensue after our discussion, is important, because I don't want us to celebrate in another 5 years the same resolution for its historicness of it. And not to undermine that at all, but hearing your statistics that in 30 years, that just what was it, from 17% to 33%,
5
just
to 33, yeah.
Or
mentions have increased. But what does that mean for women actually signing peace agreements? And when we talk about elitism and inclusion as well too, that's something that I wanted to reflect on as well too, because you raised the point about we never question men and their ability to represent an entire nation, women, youth, children. But when it comes to women, we always question, are they the right ones? Are they tokenistic? Are they representing the community adequately? And that is a real challenge as well. But then from a youth perspective as well, the localization agenda and ensuring that we're not constantly having the same women, same youth activists at these forums. A challenge that I face is that a man would never be considered as elite or a conference darling that's always invited or celebrated. They'd be considered an expert by virtue of their experience. And the emphasis on including more local actors, more youth, and decentralizing and minimizing the experience and the efforts that young women peace builders have done is also part of the challenges that exist too. Those questions would never come up if there's a man or a young man or old man. It would just be a seasoned activist. So in our bid to include more people and diversify, we also diminish the hard work in the face of often grave insecurity and risks that women take and exclude them from processes just to switch it up to make it look like we're adding in more people. So there's a lot of challenges in what these terms mean: inclusivity, localization, international actors and external organizations, sometimes even drowning out local organizations. And I was struck by some of the points that you raised as well too, Maria, about, you know, we're adding burdens to communities, but we're not also giving women an opportunity to unearth their indigenous and their traditional best practices for conflict resolution, mediation, and what they would propose on land ownership and how that would best serve them. And looking at also how there will never be a one-size-fits-all model for promoting more women's engagement in peace building. But we need to free ourselves from this toolbox approach. And there has to be much more flexibility in engagement. There has to be much more of a long-term investment in peace building. Even when we look at post-conflict situations or transitional justice, what that means for women is still from a very victimized position. So there's a lot of challenges, but I definitely believe that the knowledge and the depth of research is there. It's just the question of how do you now begin to really act on all these commitments that we make, particularly in a climate right now where there's such global trust deficit in multilateral cooperation, where people are seeing the systems and the bodies that we have, like the UN Security Council, being not as effective as communities would expect them to be. How then do we actually activate the people that are on the front lines, are invested, and also challenge ourselves to maybe restructure these institutions that we do need? So yeah,
Thank you. And I think we'll come back to maybe some of these points that you raised. Nina, I don't know if you would want to put any reaction to what was said by Maria or Ilwa just now.
No, I think that you're right, that we're still like Maria said, there is this intersectionality that we sometimes forget, that we focus on just gender and then separately age and then separately race, but we don't realize that they're all interconnected, and that's making different types of informal hierarchies depending on what race, what age you have. And we talked about barriers to inclusion, but also how we diminish women's expertise. And as you said, there is no way a man would be considered a conference darling, whereas women can be considered like that quite often. And there is also no way, and I can speak for myself, but I know I can also speak for Maria, that there is also this tendency to always address women as miss, regardless of the titles that you have, whether you have a doctor's title or a professor's title, or if you're a colonel, or if you're a captain in the army. There is this tendency to diminish the women's expertise by making sure that you always address them by either the first name or by a miss. And that would never happen with a man. And I think that this is something that's taking generations to change, but it's going painfully slow, because it's a difficult battle to wage as well, to fight for your right to be seen as an expert in the right area. But I leave it at that.
Maria.
Thank you. I'll just echo the previous points, and I'll also, this reminds me how Cynthia Enlow, so one of the most well-known feminist scholars, she was part of the Syrian negotiation process in Geneva, and she was telling how there were women's delegates who could not sit on the negotiation table, but they were in Geneva, and they were trying to fight for a seat at the negotiation table. And what they've been told was that, well, you need to come then with one position on what women want out of this negotiation. And that's ridiculous, right? Because again, you would have like 100 men on the negotiation table, each one of them representing a constituency with different interests, with different resources. And then we expect women as this homogeneous group of more than 50% of the planet to have the same interests, to have the same experiences, and the same challenges. And I would, yes, and it's true that women are not considered experts, but I would also say a little bit that what is worse, I think, is that they are considered experts, but only in the domestic sphere, in the local sphere. So they have the empirical knowledge of this little community. So we're going to talk to them on how we are going to implement this fantastically designed project that we in the headquarters of the UN in New York or Geneva have already, designed for them. So that's also another way of diminishing expertise, by putting that on hierarchical levels. Yes, you're an expert on the local community, but you would never be an expert on, piloting a project that is going to affect your everyday life.
Thank you, Maria. I wanted to open the floor. I mean, I think a lot of things have been said. We have also others in the room that I'm sure will have questions or comments. So, because if not, I mean, I have more questions to ask our panel, but I wanted to give you the opportunity. And if you're not yet ready to do that, I wanted then to.
I could ask a question. Yeah.
Go ahead. And there's another one there. Okay, good.
Okay.
This, when you choose, you get the motions.
I think a lot of things are obviously happening.
Can you say who you are and so?
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Rambo Risse. I'm an intern here at the Egmont Institute within the Africa program. I was thinking, of course, many things are happening that are, although maybe painfully, but they are slowly changing things. But obviously, that still leaves us with the short term, with the contemporary context that we live in right now. That leaves this whole group of women apart from these peace processes. So I was thinking, what are ways to incentivize change in the short term? And also by briefly mentioning what you just said, Nina, about how numbers are not enough, but necessary. We could, of course, also change that the other way around. Numbers are necessary, but not enough. So I was curious what your reflections were on that.
Thank you, Remy.
Not particularly one of them, just in general.
Do you want to address immediately, or I can bring this gentleman as well? Yeah. Do you want to? Can you say who you are and ask your question, please?
I'm from DSC, Congo Kinshasa, but I live in Belgium, and I'm involved in peacebuilding and conflict. First, I want to congratulate you because it's not the first time. Last year in Geneva Peace Week, I think you were invited to intervene in one of the sessions of Geneva Peace Week in November last year. I saw you virtually, but I'm able to speak today and congratulate for that. And just two comments. The first is about the Somali diaspora. There is now a lot of Somali abroad, and especially youth. And I wanted to ask Madame, what if that dynamic of youth Somalia abroad cannot take that advantage to make ties of to establish some network with local youth to try to change that situation. The second comment is related to the just election of the Somali president. He was president in Somalia before, and he is now re-elected. And I'm asking if the international community, I mean, there's like Egmont and the King Goldman Commission cannot push or stimulate the new president to try to give a signal by taking, let's say, parts of women in the government. You can give that big signal to the community, and when people will see also women as members of government, they can push women to accept, because that is the acceptance of men to see women in the high responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Baruti. So, I mean, just to recapitulate, Remco wanted to sort of, short-term incentives so that we can actually advance progress, and also, how we deal also with the statistics, with the numbers, and I mean, the importance that this has. And then Mr. Baruti, I think it's basically the role of Somali diaspora in local peacekeeping and peacebuilding processes, I think, in Somalia, and also what can the international community do to make sure that after the new elections, there are women in government, that they do make part of governing structures and governance. So, Ilwat, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll speak to just the question to Somalia, so that we have some diversity in our discourse as well too. But thank you for raising those very important questions. And actually, at this time right now, when we do have conflicts all around the world, but the situation in Somalia, both humanitarian crisis, the elections that not elections, we don't have democracy, but the election that we've had, but the opportunity and the momentum that we have right now, that is not being galvanized because of all the focus on, rightfully, the Ukraine situation and the impact that has, and not necessarily leveraging this moment that is so critical for the international community to actually engage, where we are actually seeing funding that was committed to Somalia being cut and redirected. And that is both incredibly dehumanizing, considering what conflict is more valuable to invest in, what commitments you can make and back out of based on proximity. So there's a lot of issues in that right, but I'm glad that you brought up the situation in Somalia specifically. And so I'll take questions bit by bit. One, the Somali diaspora. I get asked this question quite often, and a lot of young people that have had similar experiences like mine, born in Somalia, but have grown up abroad, want to get involved, but have no desire to move back to Somalia. And I think that's fine because not everyone's journey is going to be the same. There's ways for the Somali diaspora to be a part of the peace process, and also a way for them to be a part of the conflict as well too. So I myself, as a member of the Somali diaspora, have found very early on that you can't come in, even from the Somali diaspora perspective, with a savior complex, thinking that just because you have been abroad or grew up outside of Somalia, that you have the solutions and the answers. That localization still means those that have been there throughout the conflict are equally apt and capable of being a part of the process as the Somali diaspora. But there are opportunities for leveraging the critical mass that exists of this huge number of people that have fled the conflict, that have skills, that can contribute. So, and there are a lot of networks like that, and young people, particularly now, are, I think, growingly becoming more interested in being a part of the solution, and many of them intentionally doing so through private sector engagement, through infrastructure development, investing in social peace, and really on the economic development parts, because when you can create opportunities for dignity and livelihoods, it contributes to peace building as well too. So there's definitely a big shift happening amongst the youth connecting with locals and the Somali diaspora. And I try to play a big part of that in my work and in my advocacy, having lived abroad for the majority of my life, but being based in Somalia. In 2016, in the last administration, the last president just left Somalia, the international community made a lot of very conditional support to the Somali electoral process at that time to ensure that women were going to have a chance to be part of the National Assembly of Parliament or to reach the quota of 30%. And some of those provisions were making sure that women were chosen by the tribal elders first instead of the men, or not funding certain initiatives. And those conditions helped a spike from 12% representation in the Somali women parliament to 24. In the last administration, to where we are now, that number has decreased. And that is because, again, the role of the international community being very reserved, and as they should take a backseat as well too and let a Somali-led process move forward. But when women are saying they're being systemically excluded, they're not being able to participate, and we're seeing political tension, not imposing conditions has also resulted in women's participation now being less than it was before. We should have been progressing, but we're regressing. And we're seeing now, even in our provisional constitution, that things like the zero tolerance approach to female genital mutilation is now acceptable. In 2018, we had sexual offenses bill that's adopted that has been completely converted into the sexual intercourse bill that basically says that was meant to hold perpetrators to account, now essentially says rapists must have a mental illness to have committed this act, and also legalize child marriage. So we're regressing significantly, and all these things are being avoided during the electoral process to de-escalate violence. And if more women were involved, then these things would not be proposed in the new constitution that's going to last for generations to come. So there's a lot of challenges but a lot of opportunity that exists right now. And you mentioned that the last president that we had is also a new president now. People had a lot of hope in him the first time because he was local, but he was also from, you know, an educational background, not a politician. But people feel that now he has politically matured. Most people are very happy with this decision. There was no violence, and we're also seeing a lot of cooperation from other presidential candidates working with him right now to ensure that this transition is smooth and peaceful and successful. So there's momentum, and this is a key time to pay attention to the situation in Somalia. And I think that it's important to remain on the international agenda. And in addition to this incredible honor of the recognition from PBF, I think part of having conversations like this and, you know, the many meetings to come for the week really is to amplify that message. You know, it's not just about recognition and awards, but to really keep Somalia on the priority list amidst all of the challenges the world is ravaged by.
There was, I don't know if one of you wants to take Remco's question.
Okay, that's a difficult question, but I'll give it a try. Because first of all, I think that the incentives are there, they exist. What do we need more than to know that when women from diverse backgrounds are sitting on the negotiation tables, peace agreements last longer and are more respected? So what more incentive than that do we need? The second thing is that the short-term incentives that are or that have been provided have been so again making sure that we insert a 30% quota for women in parliament, or a 20% quota for women in the security forces in the aftermath of war, etc., etc. But I'm very wary of short-term solutions because, as we said, these short-term solutions tend to be quite quantitative, and that's not enough. And I'm saying as well this because we're also expecting that countries that have been on civil war and devastation for years and decades suddenly, you know, become places where we do not only have gender equality, but also we do not have any type of discrimination, that everybody has a job, that the elections are democratic, and we require that in a really short term. But look at where we are in Europe in terms of gender equality in countries that praise themselves of not having been at war for a long time. We still earn much less. We're still, I don't know how many women do we have in the Belgian parliament, but I'm sure that is much less of a percentage than they have in Nigeria, in Rwanda, just to give you a couple of examples. But also look again at what happens when we have periods of social and economic unrest and in crisis. Look at what is happening in the US. It's always gender equality that is challenged when we have, again, periods of either civil conflict or economic difficulties. Look at what is happening with the right to have an abortion in the US. So again, I guess that I would be wary of these short-term solutions. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Nina, you also want to add something?
I was thinking about Remco's question about how to address that. And one thing that I'm thinking about is that we always talk about the women's right to education and access to education, but then we don't follow up, like what's happening after the right to education. So I've done a lot of interviews in Burundi, but also in Niger with women who have a very high education, or become lawyers or diplomats, but they still can't exercise their function because they have to take care of the children. So we still have this sort of cultural understanding of women as caretakers, balancing up their access to education. So one thing that is very pragmatic, but I think necessary, is to build affordable daycare centers for children from a small age to enable women to get out in the workforce after they have had access to education. Of course, access to education is the first step, but then after that, and we can also go back to the US as an example, how many women are staying at home because they can't afford to put their children in daycare. And that's even in some European countries that is just too expensive to put the children in daycare centers. And it's always the woman because she's, for the most part, paid less than the man who has to stay at home with the children. And if she's not paid less than the man, then the cultural weight on the woman to stay at home is too heavy to go back into the other option of men staying home. And that also comes to the second question the second topic I wanted to add, and that's paternity leave. And how important it is to actually grant men paternity leave, not just because that is something I was going to say it's magical, but it's also very, very difficult and tiring. But it's something that can actually change the gender inequality by giving men the ability or the capacity, or not the capacity, but the possibility to stay at home. You're also equalizing women's possibility to get back into the workforce much earlier than was previously the case. Then, of course, you have different examples in Sweden. I know that we have 3 months of compulsory paternity leave for men. And somehow, statistically, it has been proven that they've been taken every year when there's been a World Cup in football during the summer months. But I mean, this is still a first step where we want to move beyond that to something more.
Thank you, Nina, for that. And thank you all. I mean, second round of questions, and then we will close. Yes, please. Can you please say your name? And, yeah.
So my name is Irene, and I'm a master's degree student at the University of Ghent. And so my research focus is on security studies and feminism. So you three have talked a lot about the importance of the inclusivity of all women with an intersectional approach and how intersectional is key in decision-making tables. But my question would maybe to go a bit further and maybe think about and reflect on is adding women enough to achieve that all voices are heard under the same conditions, and to break down these problematic patriarchal power dynamics that we find in the decision-making tables. Obviously, adding women is definitely essential and it's crucial, but what else needs to be done for that to happen in the long term?
Is there anyone from the virtual floor?
No.
No? Okay, just for the benefit of those listening outside, sort of, what else, from adding women to break this patriarchal sort of, let's say, cycle or, endurance there in the system. What else can be done besides just adding women? I don't know if I'm representing well your question, but yeah, thank you. So maybe what I'll do now, I'll start, because this will be our last question. I start with Maria, then Nina, and then we'll finish with Ilva. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think that so adding women is definitely not enough. But when you think about, again, when we add women, we tend to add those that are the easiest to reach. So when we're talking about intersectionality and paying attention to which women are on the negotiation table, we're also saying, and we're going into the same direction as your question, as well, if we need to ensure that rural Liberian women are on the negotiation table, then we need to ensure, again, that they are able to do so. First of all, we need to ensure that their daily activities are covered, so that, again, and going back to what Nina was saying, I had put here, invest in care work. Ensuring that these women's other burdens or other tasks are covered for them as well, because otherwise they would not be able to attend the for example, the Colombian peace agreement was very good into indicating as well that we need to have a diversity of women on the table. There were tons of also talks and seminars, discussions, And the majority of course, of rural women, poor women, they were invited, but they did not attend because they were saying, well, there's nobody to cover for my bus expenses. There's also nobody who is going to take care of my crops if I leave today and I don't have the time to come back until next week. Then who is going to cover and to pay for, I won't be able to give my kids something to eat. So I think that it is also having an understanding of what do these women need to be able to be sitting at the negotiation table. And it's not about fixing women. It is, again, about fixing the structural obstacles that prevent them from being there. So instead of focusing again on fixing women, focus on fixing the patriarchal system that prevents them from being there.
Yeah, I was going to go in the same direction as Maria and say that maybe we should stop focus on the women and focus on the structure instead and turn the table around and try to also say that for women to sit at the table, it means that some men needs to leave the table and actually leave some space for women. And that's easier said than done. And women are not supposed to have this added burden of trying to push themselves into to take a seat, but they should be offered a seat. And I think that goes much further than that. It also means in general to have men stand up and support women in different situations. It shouldn't have to be said, but it should be done to actually give it's not just women that have to push for this gender equality. It's also men that needs to push for that. I shouldn't have to give any reasons for that, but that's important to have that. It becomes a much more, it is a legitimate process, and it's a legitimate demand to have gender equality, but it has much more weight if it's not just put on the shoulder of women to carry that forward. So I would ask for more support from men in different positions to push for gender equality.
Thank you, Nina. Ilwat.
There's very little to add to what was just said, but I think that to really just reinforce those points that if we are going to focus on numbers, I think that yes, quotas and that influx and that conditionality of having a certain set of women at least at the table is an entry point, but that also becomes a ceiling sometimes. So we need to ensure that it doesn't become the cap, and that's what we constantly practice. I think it's also important that the diversity of women, inclusion to me does not mean every single woman has to be at the table, but they should be of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different influences, and have the ability to trickle that down to communities that otherwise are completely disengaged from political processes. And the appetite is there, the willingness is there, but then the means to actually participate for those women isn't. So as we've heard from Maria and Nina, to actually support and invest in the participation of women and not just make it available. It's the same as with unpaid youth internships for them to join these systems, right? You expect them to be able to participate by just announcing it, but you have to also make sure that they can actually meaningfully do that and live their lives. And I would just add as well too that even when women are in these positions and there is allyship from men, it shouldn't be dependent on just individual champions or certain male champions. I've seen that with various governments in Somalia, that you find one minister or one member of parliament or one really influential clan elder who really advocated for my organization or other youth or other women, but then when that person is no longer there, then you start from scratch again. So we need to institutionalize that culture of allyship and really having that support.
Thank you. I mean, those are very sort of wise words for us to end, especially with this idea that champions are important, and more important than that is the sustainability of these processes and the legacy that they can endure. So it remains to me first to thank our three speakers for such an enlightening and humbling also discussion. I learned a lot. I mean, this is not really my area, but it's really it's fascinating. So thank you very much for that, for helping me understand better these problems. And I think I maybe I'll speak for all of you. That's how interesting this conversation was for all of us. So, but thank you for joining us in this discussion. Like I was saying at the start, Ilwa will be here for a week, and tomorrow there's another event a little bit more focused on Somalia. So it's breaking the cycle of crisis in Somalia, how to support locally owned initiatives. So this is an event, it's the European Center for Development Policy Management that is in the lead, but it's again co-organized by Egmont, by the European Policy Center, and by the Kim Botman Foundation, of course. And this will take place tomorrow at the European Policy Center in Rue de Trône at 2:00. You can still register for that event, and you'll be very welcome to come so that we can continue the conversation. And again, I think Nina and the Egmont Institute now wants to invite us for reception. But Ilwa, what I hope is that when you celebrate, or when we all celebrate, either the 5 or even the 30th anniversary of this resolution, that we not talk about the resolution, but we talk actually of results that have been achieved. So I hope that your trip here will help you also, go further in the project that Egmont Center also has for your country. But I think overall, the example that it gives for peace, for respect for women, for children, for human rights, and for all that you stand for. So thank you very much for coming with us. Thanks.
Very interesting.